Hello.
Hey Erik, nice to meet you. I'm Sam. I'll be chairing your meeting today.
Ah, great. Nice to meet you.
Right. Just before everyone joins, can you just quickly maybe check if
Check the presentation if I can. Yes. So do you see it now? And it's not in presenter mode, it's in the right.
it looks correct as it's supposed
Yeah,
to be.
good, good. So where do you work?
I'm a master student at ETH in Zurich. I'm actually just from what I saw in your description, also in computational psychiatry, although I'm not really into like the cellular or molecular level. Uh, my specialty is more cognitive modeling or behavioral modeling.
Hmm.
Yeah. uh,
Okay, nice. So I haven't been to any of these meetings before, but it seems quite interesting.
right. So the usual format is that you'll have 40 minutes for your presentation,
Yes.
and that will be followed by 30 minutes of Q&A from people in the room, and then 30 minutes of feedback from Carl.
Yeah. Good. So I try to include, you know, different aspects of it, and I'm not sure. It's the first time I give the presentation, so I will try to make it in 40 minutes, but otherwise I will have to speed it up and skip some parts. But I guess you will let me know how much time I have and so forth.
I'll let you know when it's like when you have like 5 more minutes or so.
Yeah, that's good.
And just one quick question: do you have anything specific that you're expecting from like either from the audience or from Carl, like a specific feedback?
So I think it's more like on discussion level. What is this is sort of conceptual, and basically the reason why I contacted Carl was because I'm writing a more popular science book. And then he said, "Yeah, why don't you present instead, and then we can talk about it." But this is, yeah. So it's not so technical, but I think it's more technical than I will have in the book. The book will be more popular science.
Excellent. Okay. Then just it would be very useful to maybe make it clear either in the beginning or at the end of your presentation so that
Yeah,
like Carl will do structured.
yeah. I will do that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Good. Then I'll just have a few more minutes. Yeah, right. Hello, everyone. Erik, if I may, just one more quick question. We'll be recording the meeting. Are you okay with us also then publishing it to YouTube?
Yeah, sure. That's okay.
Okay, then I will send you the link to the recording after the meeting via email. And so let's just give people a few more minutes to join, and then I think we'll be ready to start. Okay, then so I think we're ready to start. Hello, everyone. Today's presenter is Erik Smedler, who will give a talk on the self as a dynamic model, psychiatry, prediction, and theory of mind. So, Erik, when you're ready, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, so you can hear me, all of you? Thanks for inviting me here to present. I'm Erik. I'm from Sweden, Gothenburg. Today I will talk about basically an upcoming book that I'm writing. It's more a popular science book, but I contacted Carl, Professor Friston here to discuss some thoughts about active inference, and then he suggested I could present on this meeting. So that's why I'm presenting here. So I will just briefly tell you who I am, mention some important questions in psychiatry that I think about, briefly go through the original consciousness, but more from a biological perspective in phylogenesis and ontogenesis, touch upon the active inference and simulation sort of model of the brain, and then talk about psychiatry as sort of a model for when consciousness could go wrong, or what happens when our mind is not working as it used to do. And then finalize with some thoughts about if artificial consciousness is possible. But let's start. Basically, I'm a physician scientist working in psychiatry, so I just finished my working day at the ward. But I also work as a researcher within molecular neuroscience. But my first degree was in physics, so I had this sort of interest to start with. I call myself a physicalist. That basically means that there's no magic needed to explain life or consciousness, but it arises from the matter and the laws of physics. But I think that the world we experience is a mental construction. So of course the world, as I see it, is out there, but we only experience it as a mental construction. And as I see it, that many of the symptoms my patients present with, it could be psychosis or anxiety or mood disorders, could actually be understood as a non-calibrated mental construction. And you could conceptualize it that way. And as I said, I'm writing a book. It's more popular science. It's initially it will be in Swedish, potentially translated later. And it's about the self and mind and the brain in the context of psychiatry. But first, starting with some questions I, as a psychiatrist, have. So why do severely ill patients often resemble each other? So if you look at a prototypical schizophrenia patient or somebody with the manic depressive illness, they're quite similar to each other. So it seems to be some stable states that people could fall into. Of course, they are individuals, but there are quite some similarities. An eternal question is if psychiatric diagnoses are sort of constructed or biologically grounded. I think it's both. Some diagnoses are, known since ancient times in Greece, for example, but some of the diagnoses are, of course, more modern and maybe more constructed. Then there are certain symptoms that are, they are the same, they're overlapping no matter what kind of diagnosis you have. So if you have a depressive episode with anxiety, or if you have anxiety disorder or anxiety due to addiction, usually the anxiety itself is a symptom or a syndrome that overlaps, no matter the sort of underlying cause. And then, of course, this is also a very, contemporary question. If all mental disorders are dimensional, such as ADHD, I mean, now the number of diagnosed people is increasing, especially in Sweden. And then you wonder, is this dimensional, or is there a clear cutoff between sort of healthy people or those with the disorder? And could you see disease as an extreme case of normality? Now, just to mention, for those of you not working in medicine, that diagnoses are, of course, constructed for all kinds of disorders. The classical biomedical model actually comes from this with infectious diseases, where you have a bacterium or some other microorganism that is infecting a patient, leading to symptoms. And of course, then if you treat the infection, you basically cure the disease. That's the model, or at least you remove the cause of disease. And then, of course, different hygiene and social factors are important, because if you are from a poor environment, you have a higher risk of getting the infections. Now, I would say most diseases in medicine, they are polygenic. So they depend both on genes and environment. And for example, cardiovascular disease, you have a specific sort of genetic background, and you might smoke or have a stressful work. And this would in turn lead to hypertension or sort of atherosclerosis, so that you have plaques in the coronary arteries. And in the end, after many years, this could lead to myocardial infarction. So it's both caused by genetics, environment. But here we also know that, for example, social class is sort of related to the entire process. And then if we come to the mental disorders, we don't even call them diseases. We rather call them disorders or syndromes, because they are clusters of symptoms that go together, and they should have a certain duration and severity. And there is no single cause for the disease. Sometimes when you have like we had tertiary syphilis 150 years ago or 100 years ago, and those patients were at mental hospitals, but then when people realized that this is an infectious disease, we could treat it, and then it's no longer part of medicine or psychiatry. So basically, diagnostics in psychiatry is clinical. We don't have any biomarkers. We only do brain imaging and take blood tests to exclude other causes, such as inflammation in the brain or having a brain tumor or something similar. But going to the first section, we'll talk about the origin of consciousness. Of course, we have to start with where everything comes from. So we had Big Bang more than 13 billion years ago, starting from a point and then having the universe as we know it. And then it evolved over time, following the second law of thermodynamics. The entropy is increasing, so sort of if we leave it by itself, it will in the end be maximum entropy. So there will be nothing interesting in the universe. However, even though entropy would increase all the time, sort of the complexity or the amount of interesting information in the universe would sort of first lead to a peak and then gradually decline towards equilibrium. and maybe life is possible at when we have this complexity somewhere in the middle. And this would also give us a direction of time with increasing entropy. So after the Big Bang, what happened that the Earth emerged 4.5 billion years ago? So we had sort of the physical planet, and then there was a process where many things were needed to happen. So it took some million years before we had a habitable planet. We started to have synthesis of organic molecules, so carbon-based. We had some molecules that could self-replicate and be put together in assemblies, and also, drive these different metabolic pathways so they could have autocatalysis. And at some point, we also had the cell membrane, so basically lipid-based membrane separating the inner world of a cell and the outside. So, of course, life is energy dependent, and this has been known for many years, since it decreases the local entropy. So this would sort of, it doesn't violate the second law of thermodynamics because it's the local entropy, but it's energy dependent. So you could think of it as a thermodynamic non-equilibrium. And this is just an example. If you would have a cell, so all cells in biology, they have gradients for different ions. So for example, we have high concentration of sodium outside of cells in the blood, and we have low concentration within the cell, and the opposite for potassium. And this arises due to energy dependent pumps. So you have specific proteins that will pump out sodium and in potassium. And if you would sort of not have any energy, you would lose the gradients, and in the end there would be equilibrium. It's also important to know or understand that life is not really binary. I mean, you have this sort of tree of life, and then you have certain molecules or structures that we don't really call life. So what is, for example, a virus? Is a virus living? I think that's sort of intermediate case depending on how you would define it. Okay, so once we have life, we could sort of start a process of becoming conscious. I like the concept of having a symmetry break early on, that when you have a cell, you actually have an inside and then you have an outside. And the inside is sort of what you try to, what is trying to persist in the ever-increasing entropy. And of course, the cell with an inside that you could call a cell for agency needs to find nutrients and sort of find, let's say you have some sugar molecules, and then it sort of can go in that direction. So you have a goal-directed behavior via chemicals. And then with evolution, you gradually get more complex life. So unicellular organisms would sort of fuse to create these multicellular organisms like animals. And of course they need to coordinate, so you can't have different cells within a individual organism going in different directions. At some point we start to have neurons, maybe 600 to 700 million years ago. So cells that generate electricity and enable sort of goal-directed behavior with electricity. So this is a way of also coordinating organism with multiple cells. And potentially this actually happened twice in evolution. It's not really known. Maybe both in sort of the future animal kingdom and also in comb jellies. But this is ongoing research as I understand it. And then you had this Cambrian explosion some million years later, where suddenly you had so many more species, and they become so much more advanced. And this would sort of develop the nervous system of those species. So at some point you had these chordates that led to vertebrates. So they had what we call a central nervous system, like a brain, or like a ganglia of nerve cells that created the brain as well as the spinal cord. And this enabled coordination of the entire nervous system as well as the entire sort of organism. Now this solved the problem of coordinating the nervous system, but then you get this question sort of who is in charge? And this is where now the late philosopher Daniel Dennett talks about the appearance of a self, or you could call it as a center of gravity for a narrative self, where you have, let's say you have thousands of neurons or millions of neurons, and they sort of work together, and you have to have this sort of concept of somebody being in charge. This is, of course, Daniel Dennett. Then what happened with evolution, that you had expansion of the central nervous system, and especially I would say the neocortex, so sort of the shell of the brain that become wrinkled and expanded, especially in the frontal region. This is just a graph showing the difference between monkeys and chimps and the humans, that it sort of gradually increases the size of the brain, and especially the cerebral cortex. So this is sort of the origin of consciousness from an evolutionary point of view, going from unicellular organisms to multicellular organisms, and then to animals having a central nervous system. If you would look at the baby, as a human baby in the fetus and when it's born, of course you wouldn't call a fertilized oocyte conscious. So it happens at some point. Probably it develops gradually. If you look in utero, probably it happens after sort of half time, maybe after 25 weeks or something. That's when you have the sort of the anatomical connections between thalamus and cortex. So you can start to get sensory inputs from outside into cortex. That's potentially an important step in developing consciousness. We also know that newborn infants are alert. They have some basic awareness of their own body. They would respond to their mother and father, they can hear their voices and smell and touch. And then around 5 months, they start to have this awareness of more visual experiences and look into to the eyes, and they smile to people and have more awareness basically. And often around 9 months, they have even more social engagement, and they start to be responsive to other people. So they gradually sort of create this interest in other people and realize that other people also have sort of their own agency. And at 2 years, they would usually, master this mirror test, where they can see themselves in the mirror and understand that they are themselves. In humans, of course, brain development would continue until the age of 25 or potentially even later. So in adolescence, you have increased sort of risk-taking and curiosity, and you explore the world. And this is actually when you start to reduce the number of synapses. So in the beginning, you have too many synapses, and then sort of you prune away those that you don't need. And especially in the prefrontal cortex, so in the frontal part of the brain. And this sort of enables more experience sort of based development of the nervous system. Okay, so if we look, here are different species. So to the left we have E. coli bacteria, and we have C. elegans, the nematode. We have a tree, and then sort of more complex animals up until adult humans to the right. And this is what we call life. Probably it's only sort of the right part where we have conscious life or sentient life. And as you see here, I put the red circle a little bit to the right of life, because we don't really know that if there's any sort of conscious non-living matter. So far, I would say it's empty. We don't know about any examples of non-living agency. Of course, in culture, this is HAL 9000 from Stanley Kubrick movie. It's probably not conscious, but it's an example for culture. And then it's one of the first computers. I think it's from Manchester. So just to start with some hypotheses or maybe conclusions, that consciousness as we know it in living organism has evolved over time and depends on brain function. And so far we know non-living matter has been shown to be conscious. And I would say that in analogy with the death of vitalism, that there's a specific sort of force of life. I would claim that the laws of nature, as currently understood, are sufficient to explain consciousness. And that would sort of contradict this idea that maybe there is a hard problem of trying to explain how something comes, something conscious evolves from something non-conscious. But maybe it's like with life, that the more we understand about consciousness, the smaller the problem becomes. Okay, so continuing now with brain and mind. Of course, looking at the hardware of the brain, it's extremely complex. So in a human adult brain, we have almost 100 billion neurons. And then, of course, each neuron might have 10,000 synapses. We have both excitatory and inhibitory neurons, so it's extremely complex. They connect in different circuits, so we have these local microcircuits in the cortex that are connected with each other, making longer connections with thalamus and the other side of the brain, so connecting these recurrent feedback, feed-forward networks. And this is how it could look in a schematic way for the cortical thalamus networks. And of course, when you have these sort of time-dependent complex networks, this leads to, if you want to describe it from a dynamic point of view, it's a complex dynamical system. So you can't really understand everything just from looking at individual parts. So it enables different attractor states, multi-stability, so you could have different stable states, as well as what we call emergence. So basically the sum of parts being more than each and every part by themselves. So this is flocking birds is a classical example of emergent phenomenon. So of course each bird will not know that it's part of this flock. It more sort of knows the neighbors, and when you look at the dynamic system as a whole, you get this complex behavior. And of course there are many theories. Why would you have this complex brain with all these circuits? Maybe, and this is just an example from a paper from early 90s from Dunbar, where he looked at the correlation between sort of the mean group sizes among the species and the size of the neocortex. So as you see, it's a positive correlation that sort of humans up to the right here, they have the largest neocortex compared to the entire brain, but they also have the largest group sizes that they can sort of interact with. Because it's very, computational heavy to understand that my friends, they have sort of they have a consciousness by themselves and they are thinking about me. So this theory of mind is most likely very challenging for the brain to compute. So the complex cerebral cortex would enable more complex cognition. One example is, of course, language. It's a way of transmitting knowledge. Basically, we don't have to be, the newborn baby doesn't need to know everything. They will learn by culture and using the language. And it would also lead to the theory of mind. Basically, me knowing that some other person has his or her own mind, and he or she can think about my mind. So it's sort of this empathy that we call it. It also enables imagination, stream of consciousness, so we have our own inner life. And this inner life is sort of connected to this concept of self, which is a very important concept in life. So we feel or we sense that we have a unique and continuous sort of individuality, and we have our own free will, and we can control what we do in the world. Then coming back to Daniel Dennett, of course it's difficult to understand who is in charge here. I would say in many models, when people talk about consciousness, it could be something like to the left here, where you perceive something, you see an egg, and then it sort of projects into a screen in the brain, and then you have sort of your inner self looking at this screen. It's like a homunculus or what they call the Cartesian theater from Descartes, where he sort of conceptualized self. And this is not the case, I would say, because then who is in charge of this other small person? It doesn't solve any problem. yeah, going back to this, when you have this sort of non-linear causality, you have also more non-linear phenomena, which is based on these all recurrent circuits in the brain. As you probably know, the Libet-like experiments where they try to sort of track when is a thought born in the brain, when do you want to move your hand. So they measure this using electrical recordings from the skull, and they could see that even before the person wanted to do something, they could read the signal. So it shows that it's difficult to know when something is starting. But I would say that these sort of experiments are non-informative because they see the function of the brain as a linear causality chain, which is not, obviously. Just an example would be this sort of déjà vu experiences where you think that you have already experienced something, but it's probably just your brain making a trick here, where you see yourself already doing something that you've done before. So this would lead to sort of the concept of the brain not being a detector of the environment. So we have perception, which is a way of getting information from the external world, and then we have interoception to get information about our internal world, because both are important, of course. So with the perception, we have vision, audition, touch, and our senses, and we can sort of feel where we are in the world. But with interoception, we rather have more coarse-grained information about acidity or sort of the tension in the lungs or the tension or contractility of different muscles. So we feel the internal state of the body. And this would go up through especially autonomic nervous system, but the vagal nerve is one of the afferent. So many of these, of course, neurons are non-myelinated. So the signal is sort of slower and less time resolved than in the myelinated neurons that we have for perception. And I would say that the current theory now is that interoception is interpreted by sort of our consciousness to create emotions and feelings. So we can sort of feel the rhythm of the heart, and the rhythm of the heart, if it's sort of tachycardic, we start to feel that we are anxious, maybe because we are waiting for a bad, some test results at the doctor's office. So we have both this sort of interoception of our internal body, of course, but the reason is to get homeostatic circumstances in the body. And then we have perception, which is about the external world. Now, this is a picture from Plato's cave that we probably don't see the world as it is, but we rather sort of infer from experiences. Already Helmholtz during the 19th century was talking about perception as an act of prediction, and he called it unconscious inference, that we try to understand that what we perceive, what does it come from, what was the real sort of source of information. This could be conceptualized as the Bayesian brain, so we make predictions about the exterior, also the interior, and then we compare it with sort of bottom-up signals from the external world and the interior body. So we have top-down prediction and bottom-up correction. And this would lead sort of an error signal that will change the way we perceive the world. So of course it comes from a base rule in probability theory, and it could also be used for Bayesian statistics, where we try to sort of update our beliefs about the world, as well as our interior conditions, depending on the new evidence that we get. This has been sort of developed even more, of course, by Carl and others within the concept of free energy principle, where we don't only look at sort of the prediction error, but also try to sort of update our model by interacting with the world to change the incoming information. So, continuing with some more conclusions or hypotheses. these recurrent nested networks in the brain, they would enable more advanced cognition, and this leads to more advanced consciousness, and of course this enables both culture and scientific progress and what we have in contemporary life. I would call self as an illusion, that we sort of, it's a point, center of gravity for our agency. And I would also say that the current dogma say that the brain is actually simulating the world. And the world, of course, exists, but we don't perceive it as it is, but rather we perceive it through our senses. And we try to interact in order to sort of minimize the prediction error. So coming to mental disorders, here I want to try to conceptualize mental disorder as sort of dysfunctional prediction models. And you could see it as the other side of the coin. We don't know if other species, if animals have mental disorders. We of course can see what kind of behavior they have, but it's difficult to know what let's say a dog is thinking. We can see if they seem distressed or so, but it's difficult to know. Probably they don't have mental disorders in the same way. And unlike in neurology and other parts of medicine, we haven't found any clear sort of lesions. We can't point at the CAT scan and say that that's where the error is. So here you see some examples of a brain tumor. It's very clear. You can see it on MRI or a CAT scan, and you would have sort of, you can understand the symptoms of the patients depending on the localization of the tumor. This is not the case for psychiatry. What I think is quite interesting is that severe mental disorders, they are highly heritable. So usually it runs in families. Of course, the patients have reduced fecundity, so they have less children. But why do we still have these mental disorders? Why do they survive in evolution? And just a reminder that the diagnoses are made without any biomarkers, so they're clinical diagnoses. But sort of the core criteria is that you have this functional impairment. Otherwise, it's not a disorder if you don't have any sort of suffering from it. This is a complex graph, but it basically shows or summarizes some heritability measures. So if you look from top, you can see schizophrenia, which has a heritability of 80%. So basically the variance of having schizophrenia in society is explained to 80% of variance in genetics. We have found around 25% of this variance from genome-wide association studies, so from common variants in the genome, but still we have this sort of gap of heritability. And then if we go down, we have autism, ADHD, bipolar disorder, so all of these are highly heritable. At the bottom we have PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, heritability at 30%. But that also means that, of course, you need a trauma in order to have PTSD, but most people who are exposed to trauma will not sort of get PTSD, so you still need sort of the vulnerability. So if you look here at schizophrenia, you have the 80% heritability. For bipolar disorder, you have 75 heritability. And what is quite interesting, those two are sort of correlated quite strongly on a genetic level. So usually the disorders could run in the same families, and it seems to be similar genes involved. What we can also see from this picture that, so on the sort of red part to the right, you can see intelligence, education, and income. So all kinds of other phenotypes are also, heritable, and they are also related with the heritability of mental disorders. So we know, for example, that sort of the higher genetic risk for schizophrenia, the higher genetic risk for having low education and low cognitive abilities. So you have this sort of genetic structure that affects both normal physiology and normal phenotypes and disorders in a very complex way. Usually when people talk about psychiatry, they have sort of this list of criteria and you try to fulfill it, but that's not really how sort of the body or the brain is working. But I like to see it from more a system dynamics point of view. So this is just a made-up example, but let's say Brian here, sleeps poorly and he feels tired during the day. And this would lead for him to stop going to work, and he stays at home and he becomes increasingly isolated. And as a result of this, his mood sort of deteriorates. So you could say that he becomes depressed, and then you try to understand sort of the causality chain here. So you could make this network, this is just a easy example, but where you go from insomnia to tiredness to social isolation and lower mood. And maybe all of this started with some, he broke up with his girlfriend. In principle, you could write this as sort of differential equations and try to understand what is the vulnerability of Brian. So if you have insomnia, what is the chance of becoming depressed? So for each and every person, you could, in principle, build this interconnected system of differential equations. And if you would solve it, you would get some sort of state space depending on parameters. So here is showing like a landscape where you have different stable states, and maybe you could see different disorder as alternative stable states. So you end up in the wrong states, and it's quite tricky to get out from there unless you change something crucial in this network. And sometimes in mental disorders you have these sort of bifurcation points where you can go very, somebody seems stable and then suddenly try to commit suicide. So small changes could lead to large transitions at some point. I will continue with schizophrenia. Of course, it's the prototypical psychotic syndrome. You have hallucinations and delusions, also a lot of negative symptoms such as flattened affect, and also cognitive deficits. This is just a painting from an artist with schizophrenia. And it's strongly related to how we sort of perceive ourselves. So we call it self-disorder, or ipseity is sort of the Greek word for core self. And you could see delusions and hallucinations as misguided predictions. So the patient is sort of trying to predict or understand perception, but it sort of leads to hallucinations and delusions. What is interesting from a biological point of view, that dopamine is known to be involved in prediction. And all our treatments, pharmacological treatments for psychosis, are blocking one of the dopamine receptors, D2 receptors. So people have tried to conceptualize psychosis as using the Bayesian predictive coding model. So we have these higher cortical levels that try to predict the signal, the prior, and this is compared with the sensory input. And then we try to modify our models depending on the prediction error. So this is how it would look in a sort of each and every one of us, that we compare the prediction with the sort of empirical data, and then we get an error signal that changes our predictions. So in psychosis, we might have sort of weaker priors or stronger sort of likelihood. So we would update our priors more than we should. So this would sort of lead to change in how we experience the world. So we see something and then we believe it's part of a conspiracy, or it's something that is related to myself. Many of patients with psychosis have this paranoia. And this could be explained from an experimental point of view with having increased dopamine signaling or decreased glutamate receptor function. There is, of course, some neurobiological evidence. We know that patients with schizophrenia have sort of impaired prediction. You can measure this mismatch negativity with the EEG, and you see that patients have sort of less smaller signal. They also have impaired sensory gating, so you could have sort of a repeated tone that is suddenly changed, and then you see if no, that's the mismatch negativity. So in the second one here, impaired sensory gating. So first you have a tone, and then the brain will realize, okay, the next tone, I don't have to be surprised about it. It's sort of the startle effect. But this doesn't happen in the same way in schizophrenia patients. So this could be seen as some empirical evidence of this prediction model not working as it should. This is just, people have done the same in mice, actually, trying to understand hallucination as sort of a prediction not working as it should. I will not go through it more. I'm just checking the time here. Anxiety could also be seen as this prediction model, that we sort of perceive signals from our internal world and think it's something dangerous, and that sort of will increase anxiety in a vicious cycle. So you could call it as a misinterpreted interception. I think I will skip it here. So I will finish with some thoughts about more artificial consciousness to connect it with what I work with in the lab, or maybe will work with in the lab. So this concept of computational functionalism is the idea that we could, if we sort of implement the computations by the neural circuits in any kind of framework or computer or whatever, it would sort of lead to consciousness. It doesn't matter if it's in the brain or a computer. And there is a long discussion here between different opponents in this discussion. So maybe the mind is a Turing machine. I don't think so, and I think most people don't. But that would mean it has its inherent limitations. And of course, I think many people believe that simulation of the nervous system would not lead to the same as experiencing what the nervous system is doing. So if you simulate something, it doesn't mean it's the same thing. But could we know if machines are intelligent or conscious? Well, it's difficult. Turing talked about the Turing test. It probably doesn't work anymore because of these large language models. It doesn't mean it's intelligent. It might be intelligent, but not conscious, most likely. So we know, as I said before, that all known conscious agents are from living matter. So what we do in the lab, I will not go into detail here, but basically we can generate neurons by having pluripotent stem cells. So we could take stem cells from in vitro fertilizations, or induce them, reprogram mature cells. We could take a skin cell from a patient and make it into a induced pluripotent stem cell, and then make neurons from those. And this was discovered by Yamanaka and who got the Nobel Prize some years ago. And we can sort of try to mimic what happens in embryonic development to develop neurons. Or we could force stem cells to become neurons by overexpressing sort of regulatory elements, so transcription factors. So we have different ways of generating the neurons. So we can make this in 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions as organoids. As you see here in panel A, basically the age of onset for many mental disorders goes from childhood up until adolescence. And there are many processes in neurodevelopment that could explain this. On the other hand, many of these cell models that we work with in the lab, they are more fetal. So maybe they're a bit not really valid in that sense. But what people have been doing, and we also do in our lab, is to generate neurons, and we can actually measure electrical activity, so network activity. So we could culture neurons on plates, and on the plates we have these multiple electrodes, and then we see how sort of during development how they change. So you could see here neurons being grown on a plate with electrodes, and you see that over time they start to have this network burst and oscillatory behavior that mimics sort of what could happen in the developing brain. Yes, I can skip this. So I think this paper is quite interesting. I know Carl was involved in it, at least as a co-author. I know I haven't talked about it. But where they did here, they actually cultured neurons on Mia plates, and they divided the plate into different regions. So they have sort of one input and one output region. And the output went to a software, and it sort of simulated playing this game Pong. And then you had this sort of either like a random signal or a regular signal to sort of change the prediction, to make the prediction better or worse. And it actually improved the output, so it played better. And I know now that they have used the same model to play the sort of computer game Doom. It was recently published. Okay. Yeah, I can skip this. So to finish up here with some conclusions. As I said so far, only living beings possess consciousness. And consciousness and the feeling of agency and self is likely a construction of the brain. So we feel that we are sort of one unique person. And I think that psychosis, as well as other psychiatric symptoms, could be seen as sort of miscalibrated predictions from this prediction system. And I think that in order to sort of make progress in neurobiology, we need more theories. So computational or analytical theories of brain circuits that we could test with experiments and sort of to generate new hypotheses. So of course the scientific process is very much like a active inference concept. So I think I could stop here and open up for questions. A bit more than 40 minutes. Thank you.
Invite everyone to give a round of applause to Erik. And I would just like to remind you, could you just tell us briefly what sort of a feedback would be useful, just to make sure that the discussion is the most useful for you?
I think in general, like the concept, because my research is more on like molecular neurobiology. I don't work per se with these more active inference or prediction models. Like, does it make sense? Is it understandable? And I'm also thinking about making this neuron models and trying to make some computational models of schizophrenia by using the cell models. So maybe if anyone has some thoughts about that.
Wonderful. And actually, your meeting is quite popular. We have 18 people present in the Zoom room. So if everyone has any questions to Erik, please feel free to speak out loud or raise your hand.
Hello there. Hi, Erik, and thank you for that presentation, which I found very useful. Can I ask about timescales? So the dynamics of, let's say, between different attractors, so good, let's say, prediction that is working in a way that's optimal for the organism, for the human, in the case of psychosis or schizophrenia. So let's say in the normal state or really subclinical state, and that prediction at some point goes into the other attractor, the one that's suboptimal, the one that is in overdrive and leads to clinical symptoms. But that process takes time. So one could talk about whole schemas that change over time and become maladaptive. So the model you're proposing with a neuronal substrate and those longer term timescales, how could you possibly move from one to the other or simulate the longer timescales?
So as I understand the questions, you were talking about if you try to model this in a cell model, like in vitro, how would you model? I mean, it's a very good question, and I think you can only model parts of it. You have to try, basically use the model, the capabilities of the model. I think in humans, in vivo, sort of one important aspect is sort of this synaptic pruning. So you start to have the symptoms usually late adolescence, and that's when you have a lot of prunings, and this potentially sort of changes this prediction model. One idea I had was try to use some either drugs or genetic editing. You have these rare variants of schizophrenia, like once in a million genetic variants. Maybe those can sort of exaggerate or amplify this phenotype. I was thinking about putting cells in a dish, maybe have both inhibitory and excitatory neurons, and maybe do some of this mismatch negative. I don't know, trying to conceptualize different experiments. And would it be different if you take cells from a patient with schizophrenia, or you induce this genetic variant? Or maybe if you add some stimulant like ketamine or something else.
So those would affect the parameters, right? The control parameters.
Yes.
So
Yes.
say inverse temperature or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
That's just I'm thinking about future project that one could do.
Yeah.
Of course, you can't really model the entire schizophrenia, but maybe you can model a circuit and have some kind of sort of computational prediction that you can try empirically by using the cell model.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
So I don't know what background people have. I guess it's sort of depending on your background. You think it's some parts might be interesting, some parts might not be so interesting, or vice versa.
If I can, I actually do have a question. It's more of an open-ended one, but I think in section 3 on mental disorders, you presented almost like a gradient map of like different malignant attractors, the developmental trajectory. And there was the epigenetic barrier that you presented.
Yes.
I found that really interesting, and I was just curious as to whether that was more biological or physical in nature, or whether you could extend that to various sort of various states or schemas. And just what basically the question at large is whether there are sort of buffers in place, both mentally and physically, and what you meant by that epigenetic barrier. I hope that makes sense. The
I could say
formulation.
the epigenetic barrier is probably because I took this sort of picture from some paper. And usually people have this sort of scheme for also development, that you start with a pluripotent stem cell and it sort of goes into different developmental paths. So the picture comes from there. If you have, but of course, any kind of sort of system of differential equations or these complex networks could potentially have different kind of attractor states that are sort of good or bad. And I think it's a very important concept of, as you say, like what is buffering. Maybe you could call it as resilience, or I think it's amazing when you think about how the body is so complex, the brain is so complex and complicated, and why are sort of most of us completely healthy. You start from a fertilized oocyte and you end up with having this sort of infant and then an adult, and sort of the brain is just working. So there are obviously some robustness in all these processes, and maybe some survival bias also. And I think, like in schizophrenia, of course, usually you start to have symptoms. The age of onset might be, late adolescence, and then depending on if you have treatment or not, you sort of have symptoms potentially the rest of life. But for some other disorders, like bipolar disorder, which I think is very interesting, you have usually these sort of quite long periods in between where you are basically healthy. You might have some sort of reduced level of functioning, but you don't have depression or mania. So it's a very unstable system that you, for some reason, the time scale might be months or years. But for some reason you sort of fall down into a new state where everything works differently. So let's say it's quite common that people with bipolar disorder in the spring, they might become manic or depressed. So maybe it has to do with sort of the circadian rhythm or the light. It probably has different time scales also. I don't know if it's a answer for a question, but it's a.
Yeah, it is. It was more of an open-ended one, but thank you.
Yeah.
We do have a chat. I will just try to read it to you, Erik.
So I can read. How would you envision the interaction between local neural system and a complete neural system that allow for a certain behavior to appear? And what? Yeah, I'm not really sure how to reply to this. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. It's like what parts of the brain are sort of necessary and sufficient for specific cognitive abilities or consciousness? Do we need cerebellum to have consciousness? So most likely not all parts of the brain are necessary. I mean, obviously, if you have a lesion because of a stroke or a hemorrhage or a tumor, I mean, sometimes I meet patients when I was working at the neurology clinic that had massive tumors and they were almost without any symptoms. It's very strange. Or they had some, hydrocephalus and sort of just a small cortex and still having, almost normal function. So you, at the longer time period, you have a lot of plasticity. I think different sort of complex computations or cognitive abilities might need different subnetworks. I had this idea for a project where we might try to make neurons corresponding to different parts of the brain and try to make them into sort of smaller networks. Like, could you have dopaminergic neurons and neurons from the striatum and then cortex and put them together and try to make like a small network? I don't have any clear answer to this.
Thank you, Erik. Any more questions from the audience? Please don't be shy. And hand it over to you, Carl.
Good. Is it my turn now?
It is, yes.
Very good. Thank you very much. Yeah, splendid talk. Thank you very much, Erik. I mean, it was encyclopedic in the issues that it addressed. During these sessions, what I do is try and pick out some of the papers that I've been involved with that speak to the issues you bring up. I should just say that I just ran out of time you were coming up with so many ideas and fundamental points that I only got about 30% of them in my memory through picking out particular papers. So you should be congratulated on that sort of the breadth of what you hope to communicate in your book. And with that in mind, what I'll do is I'll try and feed back things of a technical nature that I would imagine would end up as footnotes in a popular book.
Yeah.
Footnotes that just lend a technical credence or background or backstory to some of the fundamental ideas that you're talking about. I suspect you'll be aware, given the way that you articulated things, of nearly everything that I'm going to say, but because this has been recorded and we have a very generous audience here, I'll be slightly overcomplete in just going through things that, I repeat, would touch from a theoretical perspective on a lot of the assertions or conclusions that you brought to the table. In answer to your questions, is it a good story? Absolutely. I think everything you said was very current, very defendable, and would probably have certainly most people in my world applauding. One thing that did occur to me was in terms of the breadth of it, it might be useful to lend it an increasing coherence by taking the sort of origin of life, Big Bang theory, second law, through to the denouement in terms of mental disorders and consciousness, and show that a lot of the things of the mental disorder treatment and consciousness treatment rest upon or turn upon are actually emergent properties, exactly in the sense you talked about emergence from the physics perspective. So some of what I'm going to sort of briefly rehearse for you is in the spirit of trying to say, yes, that's absolutely right, and it follows from this. And in so doing, sort of clarify why your focus is exactly on the right sort of mechanisms, and probably couldn't be anything else. Certainly from looking at these things through the lens of physics and self-organization. So with that in mind, if you'll excuse me, I'm just going to give you a stream of consciousness now that tries to pick up on things that you walk through, and I'll do that to remind myself what to say next by sharing my screen and going through it. But before, let me just focus on sharing my screen first. That's the best thing to do. And I'll just share my screen. I'm going to share that, and I'm fondly hoping you can see that. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, before I start, I just sort of wanted to pick up on the last few questions you had, and your response to epigenetic barriers, and looking at it from the point of view of a cell biologist or a developmental molecular biologist, and how they view these Waddington landscapes from the point of view of cellular biology. There was an interesting, and I don't know if you're aware of the work of Esther Thielen. Have you come across her in sort of cognitive or psychological sciences?
Sorry, who did you say?
Esther Thielen.
No, actually not.
Right. So it's just this is really for the questioner as opposed to the questioned. But the taking the notions of dynamics as gradient flows on energy or potential energy landscapes, such as, say, a Waddington landscape, was quite a thing in the 1990s, introduced by Esther Thielen as a metaphor for understanding divergence and convergence in neurodevelopment, largely in the context of developmental psychology and behavior, but resting upon exactly the same maths and mathematical pictures, and in fact figures that people dealing with epigenetics were dealing with. So I just pulled this paper up, Development as a Dynamic System, from JSTOR. I haven't read it for years, but not possibly for you, but for the person who asked the question, how can you formulate this in terms of a developmental perspective? It won't allow me to scroll down. I was hoping that she would have one of the landscape pictures that you offered us during your presentation. But for you now, Erik, you might want to reach out to, or at least look at the work of people at Cardiff University in the UK under the rubric of the Converge initiative. And what they are doing is growing cell cultures of cell lines from specific variants and high-risk schizophrenia, and trying to, with mixtures of excitatory and inhibitory neurons, try to work out if there are any discernible differences at the level of cell cultures, not at this stage sort of brainoids or organoids, but just simply plated cell cultures, and then trying to interpret if there are any abnormalities and interpret what would happen if you put this into a larger network, and then actually using patients. So using mouse models of schizophrenia or with similar knockouts,
I wonder if
And
this is Jeremy Hall and Adrian.
that's right.
Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, he will probably be an opponent of my first PhD student, actually.
Oh, right.
But we also work with one of these copy number variants that strongly increases the risk of schizophrenia.
All right. So you're well connected with that crowd.
Yeah, but I mean, it's so interesting that when we sort of do the genetic editing, it's not a very clear phenotype. So you could change a lot in the genetics and still end up with well-functioning neurons.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That's the problem with experimental biology. It's so complicated.
Yes, I was mindful when you were talking about your experience in the neurology clinic. When I was doing my neuropsychiatric training, we came across people with Rasmussen syndrome with almost no cortex, including a professor of mathematics at the University in Paris. It's absolutely incredible what development can do. Right. Oh, good. Good. So you know about Jeremy Hall, and he's a principal investigator on that. And
yeah, it's interesting.
Right. So yeah, this Waddington landscape issue. I'm just going to slightly reverse order here, just to allow you, if you haven't done already, but to either reach out to or just to mention in a footnote very sympathetic perspectives. And one which is, I think, particularly pertinent to the mental disorders part of the narrative is that which is being promoted as promoted with a focus on plasticity and neuroplasticity and experience-dependent learning. So this is another kind of Waddington landscape that would support divergent developmental trajectories, framed in terms of an understanding of psychopathology and its pathophysiology in terms of canalization and plasticity and ways of remediating people who get stuck literally in one of those energy landscapes, or sort of what Ralph Hoffman used to call parasitic attractors. And you can't get out, so you're stuck in this sort of depressed mode, socially withdrawn mode, for example, or with compulsive thoughts that characterize post-traumatic stress disorder and the like. But the interesting thing I thought from the perspective of your discussion, particularly in relation to the epigenetic barriers, is this landscape formed by epigenetics, or can it be specified by epigenetics, or is it encultured in the sense that it becomes experience dependent and developmentally dependent in the larger context? I think the resolution to that question is, or one way of eluding that question is say, well, it's both. And the landscape in question is actually a free energy landscape, because the free energy determines your neuronal dynamics, but it is also the shape of the landscape changes through experience-dependent plasticity and learning. So if one considers now this attractor landscape just to be a free energy landscape, or a maximum marginal likelihood landscape, or an adaptive fitness landscape, depending upon the way that you like to think about the scale you're operating at, then you can say, look, yes, there are going to be certainly prior aspects, priors of a generative model that subtend that free energy landscape that can be inherited, but it is also plastic in the sense that it is shaped by experience-dependent plasticity, which is, underwrites my sense making and my decision making. So I thought that might be a useful sort of, again, footnote, saying that in some formulations, these landscapes that contain these parasitic attractors or minima that you get caught in can be experience dependent. They can reflect the lived experience of the patient at the same time as being shaped by the epigenetic priors, sometimes called first priors, that you inherit from your parents. So this was written by Robin Carhart Harris, and the other Dave Nutt as well. Have you come across Dave Nutt?
Yes, I actually have one. I mean, I was thinking about Carhart here. You could imagine that that's, of course, one hypothesis about psychedelics, that you could sort of change from one sort of malignant state to a less malignant state, that it sort of changes the entire perception.
Exactly. Yes. So, and I presume you will put that in your book.
Yeah, I would probably say something about psychedelics.
The mathematical picture of that, and I feel licensed to speak like this, given your physics background, is that the degree to which you can escape these, say, suboptimal or local minima. So this is a local minima in relation to this one down here, is to reduce the curvature of the landscape. And the key thing about these free energy manifolds or landscapes is that the curvature, or the Hessian, is the inverse precision. Oh, sorry, the curvature is the precision, and the flatness now becomes the inverse precision. So the precision, the statistical precision, or the curvature of these landscapes becomes a really important aspect of the geometry of these landscapes. And as the precision reduces, you become flatter, and you're more able then to escape your local minima and find another minima, or have greater opportunities for developmental flows over these landscapes. I think that's important for you, because you framed much of the mental disorders part of the narrative around miscalibration. And from my perspective, I would say that it is the precision weighting, or the estimates of the precision, that do the calibration. And if that's right, what you're saying is that some people have difficulties in calibrating the curvature of their landscapes, and therefore get stuck or trapped in certain local minima. Whereas if you could give somebody a pharmacological treatment that flattened these landscapes by effectively reducing the precision of certain Bayesian beliefs that subtend these landscapes, then that would be, if you like, a license to pursue assisted psychotherapy, for example, and then you can bring in psychedelics to do that. I'm using these words because I did see a common theme that rests upon precision.
Yes.
That allows you to link a number of, link the different parts of the story. So I'm going to sort of use the word precision. When I say precision, here inverse uncertainty, or inverse, or here confidence, or here the curvature of some fundamental landscape, in this instance, the free energy landscape. What are other ways? Or you can think of it in terms of postsynaptic gain, and tell a story about excitation inhibition balance, if you're thinking in, or if you're a psychologist, we're talking effectively about sort of calibration in terms of attentional set, attending to this, attending to that, by assigning it more or less precision. The reason I'm whittering on about that, let me just make sure. Oh no, we haven't done that bit yet. The reason I'm whittering on about that is that we can get rid of that one. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just right. Sorry. So this I can just put this up. This is a review that I wrote a few years ago, which I almost invariably put up during these presentations, simply because it rehearses a view of, exactly as you say, almost all non-space occupying lesions or traumatic injuries. Linked nearly all psychiatric disorders to aberrant calibration through aberrant precision weighting or aberrant salience. And this drills down into the different ways you can look at it. The reason I generally put it up, though, is because I'm just the amount of anecdotal evidence for this story. So there are over 200 references here, all pointing exactly the direction of, I repeat, calibration being a failure of precision weighting, i.e. a failure of postsynaptic gain control, i.e. a failure of neuromodulation by the classical neurotransmitter systems that are basically the target of all psychoactive drugs and psychiatric drugs and psychedelics. There is the ability or the curvature of your free energy landscapes that contain these potentially local minima or parasitic attractors. Again, in the
Can I ask you a question about this? So,
yes, of course.
would there be any good? I mean, what would be a feasible way of actually empirically measuring sort of the curvature or making like this sort of free energy landscape from either, I don't know, EEG recordings or MIA recordings from cell cultures, but somehow to actually estimate?
Yes. So the link there, I haven't got a paper unfortunately, but I can just say this little on the audio. The link there is to commit to a particular model of the flows on the landscape, which are effectively gradient flows on free energy, or flows that are driven by free energy gradients. They are, under simplifying assumptions, mathematically, that the random fluctuations have a Gaussian distribution. Those free energy gradients that drive the flows on the landscape can always be formulated as a prediction error, which means now that you can take predictive coding, or sometimes formulate in terms of Kalman filtering, as the description of the flow on the free energy landscape. Once you do that, then the free energy gradients are precision weighted prediction errors. So they are linearly modulated prediction errors. So now what you're talking about is building a model, effectively a sort of state space model of some EEG data that is explained by a gradient flow where the precision is now parameterized in terms of postsynaptic gain or excitability. And then you use that as a free parameter to, in your model of the data, maximize the marginal likelihood of the data. And then you can sort of estimate the precision in terms of the excitability or the sensitivity of the neuronal populations you think are encoding your prediction errors. And that's there's a paper by Rick Adams in Biological Psychiatry a couple of years ago, which applies this notion and using 4 different experimental paradigms and 4 different modalities of data, ranging from EEG, MEG, and fMRI. And all converge on the same answer, that it seems to be in the interactions between the inhibitory interneurons, fast spiking inhibitory interneurons, and excitatory pyramidal cells. So exactly as you were saying, having a mixture and coupling between excitatory and inhibitory ones. In that interaction, the thing that seems to discriminate between people with and without, say, schizophrenia, is the excitability of those coupled populations that is measured in terms of the postsynaptic gain, or the sensitivity or the synaptic efficacy of responses of one population to another one. So the empirical measurement basically requires you to write down in some way a generative model whose functional form can be interpreted in terms of the encoding of the precision or the curvature of that landscape. You can read that as measuring the effective connectivity. You can read that as measuring the Kalman gain in the Kalman filtering formulation of predictive coding. They're all mathematically the same thing, but that's how you normally do it. You basically model some flow on the free energy landscape as neural dynamics, and then you parameterize the curvature that is the precision as being something that controls the flow, and then you estimate that using some sort of usually framed as a neural mass model, or in the context of dynamic causal modeling.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, there will be other. Well, I'm sorry. There are there are two other ways empirically that you could get at this. One of them is to be slightly more phenomenological, and then go to the literature on hierarchical Gaussian filtering. And hierarchical Gaussian filtering is effectively a sort of a Bayesian filter, or a Bayesian estimation scheme that is deliberately built to estimate the precisions and the precisions of the precision. So it's a deep structure, hence the hierarchical aspect. So there is a literature on hierarchical Gaussian filtering, and then what people do is they present subjects with a particular paradigm in which they have to estimate the volatility of some experimental contingencies, say in an economics game, and then model those data and the estimation of the volatility or inverse precision given the same data or cues that the subjects were exposed to, and then use the fluctuations in the precision experimentally controlled as regressors in things like fMRI or possibly EEG. So there is also a literature out there. It's slightly indirect, but it's trying to get the same thing, trying to get the correlates of precision, or the correlates of estimated estimated volatility from under ideal Bayesian observer assumptions, and then using that to look for the correlates of that in neuronal time series. So that will be another way of doing that, using a particular task design in human subjects to get at it. But if you want to apply this to cell cultures, it's probably simpler to think about the sort of the neurophysiological implementation of that gradient flow in terms of precision weighted prediction errors, and then just interpret the coupling between the populations as an estimate of the requisite precision. In fact, this review may give you a lot of the references will actually point to this kind of work or that kind of work.
Yeah,
I hope sometimes as I read it. Right, okay, perhaps that's good. Oh, right, okay. I'm just now having got distracted from my stream of consciousness in asking a very important question. I'm going to go back to papers I thought you might you might be interested in, and just echoed or reiterated some of your key points. And I liked your treatment of the sort of the validity crisis in psychiatric nosology. I mean, that's something I think quite important, and I like the way that you frame that in terms of mechanisms and how we normally understand the distinction between disease and disorder and causality. There was a very similar realization following an Ernst Strungman session with David Reddish and Josh Gordon, who literally 2 months after this session, which was written up in this paper, then became the director of National Institutes of Mental Health in America, trying to promote these sort of more formal, mechanistic, computational approaches to psychiatric nosology. And one of the insights of that workshop, or that sort of Ernst Strungman forum, was that the symptoms that we construct as clinicians, deeply informed by history, but also slightly encultured, are the observations, and they're not the causes. And the causes are something that has to be inferred. So that was an important realization that the symptoms, including the diagnosis of the doctor, were consequences of some underlying latent or hidden psychopathological, neurophysiological cause. And then thinking about the kinds of models that one could bring to the table. So I thought that was an important point that you were making about, how do we treat a diagnosis? Is it a cause or is it a consequence? And if it's not a cause, what is the cause? And then that, of course, you enter then the whole inverse problem of understanding the structure of how suffering is generated, and use everything available to you. So I thought you might be interested in that. Your comments about consciousness, I thought were again spot on and very, very interesting. I can't quite remember, but you did allude to some self-referential argument about consciousness in terms of self-knowing and the fundamental limits on that from a Gödelian perspective. This was a paper which was never actually published. It was written and then pre-printed, largely to celebrate Chris Field's notion of an inner screen model. And this particular paper ended up, from my point of view, particularly saying that there's an irreducible boundary between self and non-self of exactly the kind that you were talking about in the cell biology or origin of life story, and that one needs basically boundaries in multicellular organization as you go up the phylogenetic tree to get more expressive kinds of behaviors that could be construed as intentional or conscious. But the argument here is that, well, the same argument here is that within one's brain, there's also this sort of nesting of boundaries in a hierarchical brain, in a hierarchical generative model that is entailed by neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. But at some part, possibly one or more, cannot be further reduced. And those things that can't be further reduced can never know themselves, but they can know the remaining blankets outside. So they can know their brain, but they can never know themselves in and of themselves. So that was one way of sort of dissolving these self-referential arguments by appeal to an inner screen that has no further inner screens within it. But the interesting thing was that Chris Fields didn't like that, or thought it was thought to be too complicated. So he completely rewrote this paper by himself effectively, and then submitted it to Neuroscience of Consciousness, and did so with a completely different pitch. And his pitch was what enables imaginative experience. So I just, you caught me when you're talking about the importance of imagination, and that simulation is not imagination. That seemed to resonate very much with Chris Field's treatment of this, again predicated loosely on the Bayesian brain hypothesis from his perspective, formalized in terms of quantum information theory. But I don't think you need to worry about that. It's just the link between the necessary information geometries or structures that would enable or support or license a description of something that's having an imagination, having an inner world that is beyond just simulating having an inner world. Oh yeah, I just put this up because the notion of a Markov blanket, I think, seemed to be the homologue of your cell membrane. And the notion of a Markov blanket is central to the free energy principle. And just to put this in a nutshell, if something is bounded in the sense of having a Markov boundary, then it can always be read as doing some kind of gradient flow on this variational free energy, which means it can always be read, or it looks as if it is doing some kind of Bayesian inference or self-evidencing, just because the free energy, negative free energy, is proportional to the log evidence of some generative model behind or inside the boundary. And then what you realize is that there are different, when you now start to think about the different deployment of boundaries, and particularly boundaries within boundaries, as soon as you move to a multicellular or a hierarchical or a deep structuring of boundaries, then the inside becomes sequestered from the the most outer boundary that contains the way that we act upon the world. And that now enables you to say that more complicated, bigger, more deeply structured things now look as if they're inferring the causes of their sensory impressions on their Markov boundary that now include their own actions. And that's an important move, I think, which sort of moves you from the trees and the worms to the mice and the humans, because the mice and the humans show some intentional behavior where that requires what is known in engineering planning as inference. You're inferring the consequences of something that has not yet happened, that is conditioned upon my action. And that is a license, you're now licensed to describe those kinds of things from the free energy principle, provided you've got this deep structure that separates, that precludes or sequesters your actual action from your apparent belief updating about your action. So I thought that was potentially an interesting way of bridging from the origin of life, the physics of self-organization, to the fact that there are different kinds of things or different natural kinds that at some point now can be described as engaging or in intentional behavior simply because they've acquired this deep structure. And that was, I'm hoping, is the next one, is it? Yes, it is. And then this paper just makes that a bit more explicit by looking at different natural kinds that you can get. And it's these, I think, you were talking about when you're talking about imagination and choosing a path into the future on the basis of what you think will happen if you did that. And that mathematically is denoted by the fact that your beliefs about the causes of your sensation cover not just the states of the world out there, but also your own actions. So there's a divorce between the actual action and what you think you're actually doing. So I thought you might like that as one way of moving from one to the other. This paper I put in because of your comments, interesting comments about the second law enabling a local violation, which of course you would have anyway in any open system or far from equilibrium, but going hand in hand with an increase in complexity, structural complexity. And that you are also saying that this depends upon, or the evidence, the evidence suggests that this increase in the structural complexity and the size of brains, or the volume of white matter, for example, depends upon having a larger social group or an ensemble of things like me. And you also then finally link that to language and communication. I feel that was in that sort of series of points you made, that there was a lot of really fundamental ideas, and the endorsement of that at a very elemental level can be found in this paper, which effectively just shows that if you put two or more things together that actually share the same world, then what will emerge through this free energy minimizing or maximum marginal likelihood, minimizing or maximum marginal likelihood maximizing, marginal likelihood maximizing process is indeed a convergence to more expressive and accurate generative models that entail a complexity arms race. So as you get more and more accurate, and you do that by actually communicating and sharing your beliefs, then the complexity has to follow, so that you get this sort of arms race that increases complexity through communication. And that this is just an emergent property of the system, set at multiple scales, settling down to its free energy minima or its marginal likelihood maximum. So this was, I thought, one example where you could say that this all sounds sensible, and there's lots of evidence for it. And in fact, if you simulate these things, it is a necessary consequence of nature just pursuing the paths of least action or doing the most likely thing that it does at nested scales. But the particular point here is that you need to have sharing. You need to share the same landscape. You need to be able to share your beliefs in order to good. Sorry, I've just got a message which was
Yeah.
good. Sorry, I have to do a keynote at Oxford University, and they're just saying it's been rescheduled to 5. Right, good, which is where I thought it was. Yeah, you were talking about perception, and you were moving towards sort of accounts of mood and emotion, and I was just thinking how one could sort of make that segue or sort of do that in terms of saying, well, you know, as soon as you've got this embodied kind of inference, you've got perception and interoception. Normally, perception is divided into exteroception, proprioception, and interoception. And as soon as you get into the world of interoception, then you have, I think, another angle. I noticed you mentioned people like Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Yes.
But you didn't mention Anil Seth.
No,
I think
I just read his book actually, so.
Oh, well, there you are. Good.
Yeah.
So I don't need to witter on about Anil's perspective. Good. Now, another person then who is not like Lisa Feldman Barrett or Anil Seth, although they're all, I think, telling the same story and largely the same story that you're telling, is Mark Soames. So the reason Mark Soames's story about feelings and emotion and psychopathology is that he also focuses on precision. So he believes that consciousness and feelings in and of themselves are just an expression of the precision that you afford certain sources of sensory evidence. And he comes at this from a sort of neuropsychology or sort of lesion deficit model. So he'll argue that, in fact, yes, you're absolutely right. You don't need your cerebellum to be conscious, and you don't need your frontal lobes to be conscious, but you do need the sources, the cells of origin of the modulatory neurotransmitter systems. If you take those cells out, then you fall asleep or you lose consciousness immediately. So from a sort of anesthesiologist's perspective, you know exactly what are necessary parts of the brain in order to maintain consciousness. And it is those parts of the brain that then broadcast into classical neuromodulators that then encode or adjust or calibrate, in your language, the postsynaptic gain that encodes the precision that is the curvature of the free energy landscape that could either keep you trapped in a local minima or release you, depending upon how you do it. So I thought it might be nice just to sort of slip in Mark Soames as a link between the precision weighting and the calibration story and consciousness and feelings as it relates to self-models that rest upon evidence from my body, namely my interoception. So if you're reading Being You, isn't it, by Anil Seth? Is that the title of his book?
Yes.
Yeah. So Mark's equivalent, which came out, I think, within months of Anil's, was called The Hidden Spring. I don't know if so this is a paper that Mark wrote, but he then subsequently went on to write a book called The Hidden Spring. So I think you might enjoy that as another take on the same, but we're all with different sort of points of emphasis. So you know they wouldn't agree in public, but from your point of view, it's all about this curvature. It's all about this calibration. My part is just very briefly, why is it that people with mood disorders have not been? Why are they apparently not subject to negative selection pressure? This is a work by Paul Badcock, just saying that in the short term, it's entirely optimal to be depressed. The only problem is when you start to, when you have responded in a base optimal way by withdrawing from some adverse, chaotic, or surprising experience, you're not now in a position to gather evidence in the notion of, in the spirit of self-evidencing or active inference, that the world has actually changed and it's no longer chaotic and surprising. And so you become trapped in these, in these behaviors with overly precise beliefs about this is the kind of thing that I am. And that behavior that ensues from those very precise local minima actually stops you gathering evidence that it doesn't have to be like this. And he's just making the point that, depression properly properly expressed over an appropriate time scale can be completely adapted. It's just that when the world changes, then it's no longer base optimal and it becomes potentially pathological. And I sort of tell the story like that. We've done this one good. I tell the story like that simply because you mentioned you might at some point want to try and simulate these things. And initially I thought you meant in silico, but then I realized you actually want to simulate them in cell cultures. But if you wanted to simulate this calibration in silico, I would start where Rick Adams started many years ago. Now, Rick is the same person I mentioned before, who was the first order author on this biological psychiatry paper that measured synaptic gain in people without schizophrenia to try and find the locus of the failure of the encoding of precision or the calibration. So this just takes you through the Bayesian gloss on calibration in terms of precision, and uses it to simulate failures of the mismatch negativity and the emergence of hallucinatory-like phenomena or possibly delusional thinking, if you think that delusions are overly precise priors relative to the precision of the likelihood of the sensory evidence. I think this is an interesting, so this is, if you like, if you had a PhD student who just wanted to do computational neuroscience, this kind of simulation, I think, would be where you started. But it also speaks to the ongoing debate, and I noticed you reference people like Philip Sturzer and the like, about whether these entrenched prior beliefs that underwrite delusional systems that can be read as overly precise priors at a high level in a deep generative model, are they compensation for a failure to attenuate the precision of the sensory evidence that would explain a failure of the mismatch negativity? One way of resolving or saying, well, perhaps that's not the right way of thinking about it. One simpler way of thinking about that is that I start off with unattenuated calibration or a miscalibration that fails to attenuate the sensory evidence at hand through a failure to, or assigning it too much precision. That then drives belief updating to form very precise beliefs at the prior level. And then the world changes. And I'm now left with very precise prior beliefs that are now no longer consistent with the sensory evidence, so in exactly the same way that we talked about before about people, for example, with depression, for a short period of time, solving the problem by social withdrawal and believing they are the kind of thing that does not engage socially with other things. But they're left high and dry when slowly another non-local minima emerges out there, but they will never know because they're trapped in their attractor. So that would be, I think, one way of taking these kinds of simulations forward. We never did this, but in principle, it could be done. And then finally, can computers ever be conscious? I like this sort of empty space. Can we have non-biotic substrates that support? Can we have consciousness that does not have a biological substrate? There are arguments to say no. There are many arguments to say no. But this is a very early one from in philosophy from my colleague Vanya Weiss, who just argues that Turing machines and von Neumann architectures can't ever be conscious in the sense of having this self-organization, the kind that you were talking about. But there are lots of other arguments along those lines. So I'm just endorsing the interesting question: is that part of the conscious Venn diagram on the outside of biotic substrates empty or not? There are good arguments to suggest it actually has to be empty almost by definition. Those arguments currently are usually under the rhetoric of mortal versus immortal computation, I can send you references if you wanted to pursue that. So that's all I had to. That's the end of my stream of consciousness. Let me stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's a lot to think about. Do you think? I mean, if you would make these sort of in vitro neuronal circuits connected to some interface software, could those ever become conscious? I mean, imagine you have some kind of sensory input from some kind of interface, as well as some kind of memory, but the memory could be the synaptic plasticity. Do you think that could have some sentience or?
Yes, if it was sufficiently deeply structured, I think that's the crucial thing. You've got to, in the same spirit that a single-celled organism can never be conscious, you have to have a multicellular, so you have to have a scale invariant set of boundaries that define cells at different scales. Exactly in the way that you were talking about the fact that you can't have lots of cells going in their own directions. There has to be the same kind of self-organization at different scales, and that can only happen when you have say a cell culture or an organoid that has a sufficiently sparse connectivity to allow for there to be this partitioning in terms of nested Markov boundaries, i.e. a hierarchical structure. So if you could engineer a hierarchical structure, then you put your inputs from the Doom computer and the outputs to the controller of the Doom computer on the outside, and then in principle, yes, I don't see that would be, and then get it to engage with its world, then in principle it could now be described as truly sentient, simply because whatever's going on the inside that is causing the action, the observable behavior, does not have direct access to the observable behavior, and therefore it must in some way be modeling its own behavior. So it has some sort of authentic agency. I think that would require some careful plating, and you wouldn't be using epigenetic bridges. You'd be using little bits of plastic, I imagine, to carve up the network, to endow it with the sparse structure that the brain has. And it's endowed epigenetically, that sort of sparse connectivity that would be essential for this kind of self-organization.
Okay. Any closing remarks, Erik?
No, I'm very grateful for you all listening and having comments and questions, and I think it's very useful for me, and it's nice to sort of put your ideas out there and interact with people and see where it goes. I like it.
And everyone, please let's give Erik one more round of applause. And with that, I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day, and bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.